Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, co-editor-in-chief with Retail Insider. Joining me today is Anastasia Regen, who is partner cybersecurity at EY Canada. Thanks for joining us today, Anastasia.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
All right, let's talk about cybersecurity. It's been an issue for many retailers in recent years. Can you talk about, what are the most common cybersecurity threats that especially retailers face these days?
Absolutely. Based on some of the most recent statistics that one of our alliance partner named Fortinet has gathered, 24% of cyber attack are actually targeting retailers. So when you think about industries, it's overly essentially retailers that are being targeted compared to other types. And within that, what we're seeing is 30% of those attacks are typically phishing. So that would be the common techniques that you would see, such as emails being the most common one, but more and more we're seeing phone phishing as well as text phishing as part of newer trends. The second one would be malware. The third one would be ransomware, with approximately 13% of attack and malware being approximately 20%. And then the remaining percentage are spread between 10% denial of service attacks and the last one are all type of other types of threats that we're seeing in the market. So as you can tell, the traditional techniques being phishing, malware, and ransomware are very prominent in the retail industry.
Okay, for those consumers out there, and obviously a lot of consumers like myself are not technical,
Adverse.
technically savvy,
Yes.
right? And so maybe explain just a little bit of what phishing is and those different categories of phishing and what they are and how they operate.
Absolutely. So phishing is essentially a social engineering technique that aims for someone to be able to have you create an action that in turn will help them either gain access to your personal information or access to your device, such as your computer. The most common way that we're seeing it over the past 10 years is you would receive an email with some sort of a call to action and a sense of urgency is usually the key technique that they use that would request of you to take a specific action. The two most common types of action would be for you to click on a link. And typically, what happens next is they want to harvest your credential. So they want you to log into a website that is meant to look legitimate, for example, but
Mhm.
isn't, in a way to capture your username and password. Another one that we're seeing is they would want you to download a file. So it can be something that looks like a picture, it can be something that looks like a PDF, whichever it is. And then the idea is this is a malicious file that once downloaded it into your computer, for example, would enable them to take various actions. Some of the actions that we're seeing is they will monitor what you're typing on your keyboard. So then and there, they can get your credentials, your passwords, and so on and so forth. And then, depending on whether it's your personal laptop or your work laptop, it may actually allow them to maneuver within the infrastructure of the organization, escalate the privileges, and then do a lot more damage once that happens. So
Mm.
that would be for the most traditional type of phishing. What we're seeing more and more are phone phishing. So a good example of that is someone calling you one day and pretending to be from an organization. One of the ones that I see the most right now are pretending to be Rogers, Fido, or potentially one of the courier that is delivering packages. And
Mm.
they will want to try to get some information through this conversation. So typically speaking, personal information is what they're trying to achieve there.
Mm.
And then the one that we're seeing the most, which I'm sure you may have received yourself, would be text messages that arrive directly on your phone, such as your package is still in transit, please click on this link,
Yeah.
or CRA, you haven't paid your taxes, please click on this link. We've seen other ones around travel or potentially donations for charity. They have a wide array of scenarios that they're using. The commonality between all of them is they want you to click on a link, they want you to share credentials, and there's a sense of urgency to some extent to
Okay.
you taking an action.
So tell me, why are retailers and the retail sector so vulnerable to this?
Of course. There's a few couple of things, which is retailers actually have access to customers. So the impact that they can have by targeting a retailer in gaining access to personal information can be quite significant. Essentially, the trends that we're seeing in the retail industry right now is to gather a lot of data around customers. And that amount of data is very beneficial for trends such as targeted marketing, personalization of the services or the products that customers are getting to. But the flip side of this is a wealth of data that malicious threat actors can try to get access to create damage not only to the retailer itself, but also to the area of customers that the retailer works with. Additionally to personal information, there's a very appealing additional factor, which is credit card information.
Mm,
Those have a lot of value and they can lead to significant amount of fraud when and if successful. So those two factors, with the additional fact that the retail industry from the cybersecurity perspective is a little bit less mature than other industries, make it a very appealing target for attackers because depending on the retailer and how mature they are individually, the defense that are in place may not be as strong as what we're seeing in other industries like banking, which started many, many years ahead of retail in securing their perimeter.
yeah. Um, Tell me what retailers can do to protect themselves and then protect me as a consumer.
Which I think we'll all agree is a very necessary task. So there's a few different things. The first and the best recommendation that we tend to give over here at EY is to look for a proactive and preventative approach. Now, what does that mean? Proactive means essentially be ready for a potential negative exploit to arrive within your organization. We often say in cybersecurity, it's not if, it's when.
Mhm.
So the devil will be in the detail of how prepared are you to respond when something occurs. And
Mm,
there's various elements that goes into preparedness that can be around, do you have the right playbook so that you know exactly what to do, who to call, and what to execute should something happen? Have you tested those playbooks so that you can see how all of the different people in your organization that have to be mobilized work together in the event of an incident to effectively respond to this incident? Do you have the right providers supporting you if something happened that you're ready to call? Like incident response retainer is a very common thing that organizations do in those instances. That would be for, say, the preparedness aspect. Now, the additional proactive aspect is think about having the right security guardrails within your organization. My personal favorite, which is often overlooked to some extent, is humans need to be ready. That means trains your employee in recognizing something that looks suspicious.
mhm.
Train them to be able to recognize phishing emails, for example, or voice phishing email, for example, and so on and so forth. Test their knowledge and don't go beyond the basics. Look at the more sophisticated way that attacker tends to come today when
Mm.
they're trying to target organizations such as retailers. Train your executive to recognize the same because executive credentials are actually very high value in the market nowadays. And last but definitely not least, when I think about the training, it's train your teams to learn how to work together across silos. So that cybersecurity isn't a team that is operating on their own, but rather they know how to work with legal, they know how to work with customer service, they know how to work with the rest of IT to be effective. And the last layer is think about your security controls that you have in place. What are you doing to monitor what's happening on your infrastructure? What are you doing to monitor what's happening, for example, on your e-commerce front, if ever the organization has one? What
Mhm.
are you doing to make sure that you're obtaining the right intelligence to adapt your control? So are you, for example, doing any threat intelligence, such as open source threat intelligence, or joining communities such as Retail and Hospitality ISAC that shares that intelligence with other retailers across the globe? And the very last few things would be around what kind of technologies have you invested in to have the ability to effectively respond to more sophisticated type of attacks. The most common one that we're seeing as being beneficial on top of the traditional ones in nowadays are anything pertaining to do um, essentially see when their bots are happening on your e-commerce front and have the ability to take the appropriate action if you're seeing a lot of bot action. Bot being an automated little, um, I guess, robot that would try to take certain type of action
Yeah.
and making sure that the APIs, apologies for the technical term, but essentially the API for all of your e-commerce front are appropriately secured with the RAP authorization. And these are just on top of my head, but I'll summarize it as such, which is think proactively, holistically, and strategically about the right mix of technical and non-technical security controls that will allow you to both protect your perimeters, but also make sure that the people within your perimeter have the ability to recognize and take the right actions.
Hmm. The last thing I wanted to ask you about is, in recent years, we've seen, and I'm not going to mention the names because it's part of the question I'm going to ask, but we've seen some major retailers hit with security issues. And some, I know one in particular that was basically stores shut down for quite a good period of time. Uh, what does that do to the consumer's trust when something like that happens to a retailer, that they become vulnerable and something has happened with a cybersecurity risk, and how as a retailer, once you've experienced that, how do you regain that trust in the consumer?
That's a very good question. So the most immediate impact is the one that we refer to as reputational impact, which
Yeah.
is typically you start seeing a lot of social media chatter, mostly negative, pertaining to how customers feel about what's happening to the retailer that's being attacked, and potentially the fear of what that means for their own data or their own ability to go about their day. That would
Mhm.
be the most immediate one. Typically speaking, when we're thinking about reputational risk, the most direct outcome of this is essentially a drop in what you're seeing from a revenue perspective, at least in the short term, because your customer may be taking their business elsewhere in the meantime. Even if your store isn't closed and you still have something to sell on your shelf, in some instances, it can actually incentivize them to go to your competitors. Now, when it comes to what can be done to make sure that you regain your trust, there's various elements in place that are going from a PR strategy that is well crafted, having the ability to know how to talk about it, when to talk about it, and have a certain sense of openness with your customer in terms of when, obviously, things can be shared, what happened, and what are the steps that you're taking to be able to protect their data if ever this is something at stake in this particular instance. In some instances where credit card information was at stake, the retailer actually had to proactively register all of the impacted customers into credit monitoring to make sure that they do not have additional personal impact whenever something occurred to their credit card information being breached. There's various playbooks depending on what happens, but the best two recommendation is have a PR strategy crafted ahead of any potential incident occurring so that if something happens, you
Yeah.
have the ability to execute it really quickly and efficiently. And then you have the ability to focus on what is the layer of impact that needs to be communicated rather than how you're communicating
Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Anastasia, for joining
it.
us today.
Thank you for having me.